The jungle does not keep secrets. It only buries them until someone dares to dig. And that night, under the weight of an unseen terror, with the wreckage still smoldering and whispers slithering through the trees, they realized something was watching them, something that had been waiting. Agatha Morrow never trusted the skies. Air travel was an audacious defiance of nature, an act of reckless arrogance that suspended frail human bodies above an unforgiving world. Trains were civilized. They allowed one to observe, to listen, to remain grounded in the certainty of iron and earth. But here she was, trapped in a silver-winged beast, suspended high above the African jungle, the engines humming with a mechanical unease that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The cabin, though adorned with lavish fixtures, did little to dispel the unease settling in her bones. The air was thick, cigar smoke curled in languid tendrils, mingling with the rich musk of cologne, and the sharper, more primal scent of unease. The muted clinking of ice in crystal glasses punctuated the restrained murmur of conversation, the rustle of silk against leather, a whisper beneath it all. Across from Agatha, Sir Reginald Dunthorpe, a reclusive magnate with the hawk-like gaze of a man who trusted no one, traced a gloved finger along the rim of his glass, his eyes flicking again and again toward the battered brown valise tucked beneath his seat, his feigned indifference betraying something altogether different. To his right, Dr. Peregrine Stratton, an academic of some renown, argued with a sunburnt, sharp-eyed traveler who introduced himself as Roland Vassar, a man whose presence radiated the restless energy of someone more comfortable in the wild than in a world of polite conversation. "Call it archaeology if you will," Vassar murmured, his voice like distant thunder, but the dead do not often give consent. Agatha allowed herself a small knowing smile. A few seats away, Evelyn Whittaker, a nurse whose air of quiet competence spoke of years tending to others, turned a page in her well-thumbed medical journal, the only sign of her wariness the slight press of her fingers against her temple, and then, without warning, it began. A tremor, deep and unnatural, shuddered through the plane, not the casual jolt of turbulence but something else, something that sent ripples through the very bones of the aircraft. The lights flickered, the engines coughed, choked, then fell silent. A woman gasped. The steward staggered forward, barely catching himself against a polished brass rail, and then the sound, a groan, deep and metallic, as if the plane itself was crying out in protest. The floor tilted savagely, a scream, sharp, raw and terrified, sliced through the air. Overhead compartments burst open, luggage tumbled, glass shattered, the intercom crackled with a garbled mess of static and frantic voices, and then, unmistakably clear, dreadful in its finality, the captain's voice: "Brace for impact." No time to think, only movement, instinct, chaos. Sir Reginald's mouth formed a silent curse. Dr. Stratton braced against the seat in front of him. Miss Whittaker shielded her head as debris rained down. Agatha gripped the armrests, steady, waiting, then impact. The world fractured, split apart in a kaleidoscope of sound and force, and then nothing, silence, darkness. When Agatha awoke, the first thing she noticed was the ringing in her ears, a shrill, disorienting whine that masked all else. The second was that she was alive, a fact that in itself was astonishing. The fuselage had been torn asunder, its gleaming, ordered interior now a twisted, crumpled husk half swallowed by the dense embrace of the jungle. Smoke curled through the air, thick and acrid, mingling with the damp, loamy scent of the earth. The distant flicker of lantern light painted eerie shadows against the wreckage. Agatha exhaled, steadying herself. There would be survivors, there would be the injured, and she suspected, there would be something else, something more than just an accident, more than just a crash. Because among the living, someone on this flight had a secret, and secrets, she knew, had a way of surfacing when the world came undone. It was a rain-drenched night when Alistair Graves first sensed that something was wrong, the kind of unease that seeped through the walls, a silence so deep it carried its own sound. This was not just a journey, it was a test, a puzzle on the verge of unfolding. The luxury private jet of Zephyr Airlines, en route from Paris to Cairo, shuddered as it cut through dense storm clouds, a tremor that wasn't just turbulence but a warning. Inside the cabin, the passengers were lost in their own worlds, but Alistair saw, he felt, he listened, a shift in the air, a gaze that lingered too long, a hand clutching a small velvet pouch in a coat pocket with a little too much caution. There was something more in the air than just the scent of cigars and whiskey, something hidden, something dangerous. Lady Eleanor Winthrop, a renowned historian, ran a finger over the title of her book while holding a delicate glass of champagne, but her expression held a quiet sorrow, as if she carried a secret too heavy to bear. Across from her, Maxwell Holt, an ex-military strategist who had spent his life planning battles, stared at the ticking hands of his watch, as if even time itself were a part of his strategy. And in the dimly lit corner, Lucien Voss, an enigma, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, swirled his whiskey with calculated ease, as if everything was unfolding exactly as he had expected. But the real danger was someone else, someone still unknown, someone who had not boarded this flight simply to reach a destination, but to fulfill a purpose. Then it happened. First a jolt, subtle but unsettling, then a flicker of unease across the passengers' faces, followed by the sound of something deep within the aircraft, stuttering, hesitating, failing. For a brief moment, Alistair saw the cabin lights flicker, and his pulse quickened, not with fear, but with certainty. A scream pierced the air as the jet lurched violently to one side. A steward lost his footing, glasses shattered, and then the dreaded announcement crackled over the intercom: brace for impact. This was not just an accident, this was not just a failure of machines, this was a carefully set stage for something far more sinister, and one thing was clear: when this flight ended, not everyone on board would be alive. The jungle smelled of damp earth and burning fuel, a thick mist rising through the wreckage as smoke coiled into the night sky. The moment Alistair regained consciousness, his first sight was not the scattered luggage, not the twisted metal, not the flickering flames, but a body. Someone who had been alive mere moments before the crash, someone who had still been breathing while the aircraft plummeted. But this death had not been caused by the impact. The unnatural angle of the man's neck, the eerie stillness of his form, this was not a victim of misfortune, this was murder. And now, here in this jungle, only one question mattered: if they had all perished together, it would have been an accident. But when one among them had died differently, it meant only one thing: the killer was still among them. The thick jungle air clung to them like a second skin, heavy with the mingling scents of damp earth, burning fuel, and something far more unsettling: blood. As the wreckage smoldered in the moonlight, its twisted remains groaning in protest against the weight of what had transpired, Evelyn Harcourt surveyed the faces around her. Some were pale with shock, others tight with calculation. They had survived, but not all had been so fortunate. A body lay motionless among the debris, its limbs contorted at angles nature never intended, and even from a distance, Evelyn knew this was no accident. The hush of the jungle deepened, the usual nocturnal symphony of insects and unseen creatures stilled, as if the very earth itself recoiled from the gravity of what had been done. A man was dead, and yet it was not the crash that had claimed him. His hands still curled into the remnants of what might have been a final desperate grasp, betrayed a different truth. His struggle had come not with the descent, but with something, or someone, else. "Well, this is rather unfortunate," murmured Lord Sebastian Ashford, brushing specks of dirt from his immaculate, albeit now tattered, waistcoat. His gaze flickered toward the body, and for a fleeting moment something colder than mere inconvenience darkened his features. A tragedy, to be sure, but surely we have more pressing matters at hand, like survival. Dr. Edwin Lovell, ever the pragmatist, knelt beside the corpse, fingers brushing against the man's throat before sighing. "Dead before the crash," he confirmed, though Evelyn noted the slight furrow of his brow, "his neck broken, and this," He picked up an object that had been flung just inches away, a cigarette case, its silver surface pristine, except for the unmistakable smear of crimson. Curious, wouldn't you say? Evelyn said nothing. She was watching the others. The way Lady Rosalind Winthrop, widow of some notable but long-forgotten baron, tightened her grip on the pearl necklace at her throat. The way Mr. Nicholas Vance, a traveller with a past shrouded in half-truths, adjusted his stance, distancing himself ever so slightly from the scene. The way young Oliver Finch, barely out of university, swallowed hard and refused to look at the body at all. Every detail mattered. Every reaction spoke volumes. "We're not alone out here," Oliver said suddenly, his voice shaking as he turned toward the jungle. Someone is watching us." As if on cue, the jungle exhaled, a rustling in the undergrowth, a shadow that slithered just beyond the reach of their flickering lanterns. The illusion of safety was slipping, unraveling thread by thread. "We need to take stock," Evelyn finally spoke, her voice even but firm. "What we have, what we lack." And most importantly, her gaze settled on the body once more. "Who among us has already played their hand?" Silence followed, and in that silence the truth coiled, waiting to strike. The jungle awoke with an eerie sigh, mist curling through the skeletal remains of the wreckage, where metal twisted like broken ribs, and the scent of charred fabric clung stubbornly to the air. Dawn had arrived in hesitant slivers, casting long shadows through the trees, illuminating weary faces lined with exhaustion, and something else, something darker. The night had not been kind to them. They had huddled beneath salvaged blankets, listening to the distant calls of unseen creatures, the eerie rustling of leaves that suggested movement where there should have been none. But sleep had eluded them, not because of the jungle, nor the wreckage, but because of the thing lying beneath a makeshift shroud of torn linen, conspicuously still in a world brimming with life. The body had been found hours ago, yet no one spoke of it. That, Evelyn Harcourt thought, was the most telling sign of all. She sat apart from the others, quietly observing. It was what she did best. The survivors moved through the clearing with varying degrees of purpose. Sir Alistair Kent, the esteemed financier, was searching for something with increasing agitation, muttering about a missing satchel, as if its absence were the greatest misfortune of the night. Dr. Lionel Graves crouched near the wreckage, sifting through fragments of metal with the detached scrutiny of a man analyzing specimens rather than looking for practical supplies. Nicholas Drake, the adventurer with too many secrets and too few words, picked through the remains with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before. And then there was Eleanor Reed, the unassuming nurse, who had been the first to uncover something truly significant. It happened quickly, almost too quietly to be noticed. A flicker of silver caught the morning light, a glint, half buried in the dirt, peeking through the scorched debris. Eleanor knelt beside a crumpled seat cushion, fingers brushing hesitantly against the object, before lifting it free. "Strange," she murmured, brushing away the clinging dust. A cigarette case, exquisite, untouched, impossibly pristine amid the wreckage. It was engraved with fine art deco etchings, elegant in a way that suggested wealth and refinement, but it was the inscription that made the air grow still. "Turah, settling old scores." The words were delicate, precise, carrying a weight that far outstripped the object itself. A message of finality, a promise fulfilled. Evelyn's breath stilled. "It doesn't belong to any of us," Eleanor continued, glancing around. No one spoke. No one claimed it. And in that silence, something shifted, something imperceptible but undeniable. Sir Alister's fingers twitched against the lapel of his coat. Dr. Graves adjusted his spectacles too deliberately. Nicholas Drake's expression did not change, yet his hand, resting against his belt, had curled ever so slightly into a fist. Someone recognized it. Someone wished they hadn't. Evelyn reached for the case, turning it slowly in her fingers. It was heavy, its surface cool against her skin. She ran a thumb over the inscription, noting the lack of scratches, the impossibility of such a delicate thing surviving such devastation unscathed. A peculiar object to endure where so much else had not. "Silver is like memory," she said softly. "It holds on to what matters and lets go of the rest." A beat of silence, then a rustling too deliberate to be the wind. The jungle, never truly still, seemed to tighten around them, listening, watching, waiting. And Evelyn knew with a certainty that sent a slow chill down her spine, that someone among them was no mere survivor. Someone had come here with purpose, and that, more than anything else, changed everything. The jungle had shed its veil of mist, revealing itself in all its merciless splendor, the golden shafts of morning light slashing through the dense canopy, casting an uneasy glow over the smoldering wreckage. The air, thick with damp earth and the cloying scent of burnt fabric, seemed to pulse with an invisible tension, a presence lingering just beneath the surface. They were alone here, except they weren't. Not entirely. Something watched. Something waited. Evelyn Harcourt sat at the edge of the clearing, the cigarette case cool against her palm, its weight deceptively light yet burdened with unspoken truths. It should not have been there. That was the first troubling thought. If it had belonged to the dead man, why had it not been found on his person? Why had it been buried in the wreckage, nestled among the torn seat cushions as if discarded, or more deliberately placed? The engraving remained crisp, undisturbed by fire or chaos, to her settling old scores. Not a gift, a promise, a warning, perhaps even a death sentence. The others had seen it, they had read the inscription, and in the silent flicker of their expressions, Evelyn had noted what she needed to: the barely perceptible shift of Sir Alister Kent's shoulders, the tightening of Dr. Lionel Graves' jaw, the faintly amused twitch of Nicholas Drake's lips that did not quite reach his eyes. Eleanor Reed, the nurse, had hesitated a beat too long before looking away. They all knew something, and yet none of them spoke. Evelyn smiled, a small knowing thing, as she turned the case over once more. Objects had a way of revealing truths their owners wished to keep hidden. A person might lie, but their belongings rarely did. The cigarette case was speaking. It was only a matter of listening. The survivors had gathered, not by force but by the unspoken understanding that things needed to be acknowledged, even if not outright said. It was, after all, the practical thing to do. A meeting, a simple taking of stock. Yet, beneath the surface of polite acquiescence, Evelyn sensed something sharper, a curiosity laced with quiet dread, a need to measure one another. Somewhere among them sat a murderer. Sir Alister Kent, impeccable even in ruin, exhaled as if resigning himself to an unpleasant chore. Sir Alister Kent, he announced. Investor, businessman, advisor to His Majesty's government. Occasional, murmured Dr. Graves, a thin smile curving his lips. The financier's gaze was cool. One does not care to be tiresome about such things. Evelyn's eyes flickered over him. Modesty was not a quality often attributed to men like him. Dr. Lionel Graves, the archaeologist, said next, adjusting his spectacles with deliberate ease. Formerly of the British Museum. Formerly, a single word, yet weighted, deliberate. She saw the flicker of recognition in Nicholas Drake's gaze before it smoothed into something unreadable. Drake's turn came, and his smile was lazy, practiced. Nicholas Drake, he said, voice unhurried. A man of many trades. What sort of trades? Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than expected. Drake's smile did not falter. Whatever is needed, darling. A deliberate pause, a flick of his fingers against the handle of his pocket knife. Not a threat, just a reminder. Eleanor hesitated only a fraction before answering. Spine straight. Eleanor Reed, nursing sister. Worked in Egypt, India, and elsewhere. A woman used to hardship, practical, perhaps too tightly wound. The last to speak was Andrew Mallory, the injured steward, his voice hoarse yet firm. Mallory, steward of this damned flight. A glance at the wreckage, not much else to say, is there? Evelyn tilted her head slightly. There's always something to say, Mr. Mallory. A hesitation. Then almost grudgingly, used to be in the Navy, before this job that is. Ah, there it was. The unnecessary clarification. The thing left unsaid. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the cigarette case. The first clue had revealed itself. The rest would follow. It was only a matter of time. Fascinating, isn't it? The way silence stretches, warping the space between carefully chosen words, between the stolen glances and the things left unsaid. The wreckage sat at the center of their small, unwilling encampment, jagged metal and torn fabric standing as a monument to disaster. But Evelyn Harcourt knew better than most that true confinement had little to do with physical space. Isolation was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of secrets, and in this group, she suspected, there were plenty. They had named themselves, sketched vague outlines of who they were meant to be, but it was in the details too precise or too carelessly given that the real truths lay. A man of influence with something to lose, a disgraced academic who had seen ruin before, a smuggler, too fluid, too adaptable, a nurse, steady but watchful, a steward with too many loose ends trailing behind him, and one among them had already killed. Evelyn folded her hands neatly in her lap, allowing the tension to thicken, allowing them to shift under its weight. Then, ever so gently, she smiled. "Shall we begin?" The jungle, vast and unyielding, had begun to feel strangely small. Sunlight dappled the clearing, mocking in its warmth, indifferent to the undercurrent of unease. It was a game, though they might not yet realize it, and Evelyn had always been very good at games. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who listened more than they spoke, who had long since learned that people revealed more when they thought no one was listening. Sir Alister Kent had settled himself in the scant shade of the aircraft's broken wing, polishing his spectacles with the sort of patience that suggested irritation rather than care. "A ghastly situation," he said, the moment she approached, as if he had been waiting for an audience. "Simply ghastly, and no doubt we shall endure further indignities before this is over." Evelyn tilted her head, as though considering. "I do hope not," she said, and her smile was pleasant, agreeable, though whether she meant it was another matter entirely. His gaze sharpened, uncertain whether she was humoring him or mocking him. "You must be eager to return to England," she mused. "I imagine you have interests there." Sir Alister sniffed. "Business concerns, yes. Important ones." A pause, calculated. "And frankly I had assumed my affairs would be in order upon my return. If not," he waved a hand, dismissive. "Heads will roll." An interesting choice of phrase given the circumstances. "A man of means," she said lightly. He hesitated, then with a forced smile, "One does well enough, Miss Harcourt. But fortunes, as I'm sure you know, are not what they once were." Ah, now that was revealing. A man accustomed to wealth speaking as though it were a fragile thing. A man who had perhaps lost more than he cared to admit. She filed that away. Dr. Lionel Graves was seated on a fallen log, frowning at a half-burnt map retrieved from the wreckage. He did not look up as she approached. "Curious, isn't it?" he said, as though continuing a conversation she had not yet started. "Quite," she agreed, watching him rather than the map. "Ancient civilizations do leave us with so many mysteries." He glanced at her then, expression unreadable. "You're interested in history." "Not so much in history as in human nature," she said, smiling. "But I find the two tend to overlap rather a lot." Something about that seemed to unsettle him. She let the moment linger before tilting her head. "Did you know the deceased well?" A pause, the barest flicker of something annoyance. Wariness, before he gave a carefully constructed shake of the head. "Not at all. A fellow passenger, nothing more." Evelyn folded her hands. "And yet you seem rather intrigued by his possessions." Dr. Graves exhaled sharply, setting the map aside with more force than necessary. Miss Harcourt, the world of academia is not as genteel as people assume. Rivalries exist. Fortunes are made or lost on discoveries. If I seem intrigued, it is because I recognize a pattern when I see one. A beat. Then quieter, I have, let's say, encountered men like him before. A telling statement. Her next conversation was less an interrogation and more a confirmation of what she already suspected. Nicholas Drake, the so-called procurement specialist, was precisely as evasive as one would expect. "You travel often?" she asked. "Constantly," he replied, smiling in a way that suggested he enjoyed being difficult to pin down. "And yet you seem remarkably unfazed by all this," she observed. He shrugged. "I've seen worse." "Indeed, much worse." He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. At the far edge of the camp, Evelyn found Eleanor Reed tending to the still unconscious steward. The nurse's hands were steady, her movements precise, but when she glanced up, there was something in her eyes, something colder, sharper. The first pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. The rest would follow soon enough. It was only a matter of time. The jungle was not silent. It pulsed with the quiet, living breath of 1,000 unseen eyes, its thick canopy shifting as though it, too, listened. Evelyn Harcourt moved with practiced ease through the undergrowth, her steps deliberate, her expression serene, but her mind, ever sharp, catalogued every detail. She had long since learned that answers were rarely found in crowded rooms or forced conversations. They emerged in the spaces between words, in the gaps where silence grew heavy, and here, in the dappled twilight of the jungle, something was stirring, not in the rustling of leaves or the distant calls of unseen creatures, but in the very air itself, thick with the weight of something unresolved. She had spent the morning watching, listening. They had spoken in careful half-truths, shaping their words like shields, deflecting rather than revealing, but it was the things left unsaid that had intrigued her the most. Elijah Sloane, the ever-affable smuggler, had been the first to betray himself, not in words, but in what he withheld. "I told you," he had murmured into the shadows, unaware she was near. "I don't have it." A pause. Then lower, another voice, unfamiliar, but edged with quiet menace. "That's not my concern." She had drawn back before they could sense her, but the exchange had been enough. A debt, an object, something worth lying for, something worth killing for, but it was not until she searched the dead man's belongings that the pieces began to take shape. Tucked within the inner lining of his coat, unnoticed, untouched, was a slip of brittle parchment, frayed at the edges, the ink faded but not lost. A map, but not a modern one. Ancient, its symbols drawn in a hand both careful and urgent. She turned it over in her fingers, noting the creases, the faint scent of something earthy and old. It had been hidden deliberately, overlooked by the one who had rifled through the dead man's pockets. Or perhaps, left untouched for a reason. She exhaled slowly. This changed things. A cigarette case had been found earlier, its metal scratched with age, its inscription cryptic but purposeful. Debts must be paid. She had thought little of it at first, but now, in the dying light, as she traced the fine etchings on the map, a strange realization settled over her. The script, ornate, symmetrical, matched something else she had seen, not in the wreckage, not in their meager camp, but out there, in the jungle itself. She moved quietly, retracing her steps to where she had paused earlier, beside the gnarled roots of an ancient tree. She had noticed something then, a faint pattern carved into the bark, precise and deliberate. Now, with the cigarette case in one hand and the map in the other, the similarity was undeniable. The same intricate markings, the same sense of intention. Coincidence? No. The jungle, it seemed, had been keeping its own record. She pressed a hand to the bark, feeling the depth of the carvings, and for the first time in hours, allowed herself a small smile. They had come here for different reasons, each carrying their own shadows, But someone among them had not stumbled upon this place by accident. Someone had known, someone had followed a trail long before the plane had ever fallen from the sky, and that someone, she suspected, had already killed. The jungle was never truly silent. It exhaled in slow, shifting breaths, branches whispering overhead as unseen creatures wove between the shadows. Beneath its emerald canopy, Evelyn Harcourt traced her fingers along the rough bark of a tree, her eyes narrowing as she adjusted her perspective. The carvings were not random. They extended beyond this single trunk, stretching in an intricate flow beneath moss and ivy, their meaning obscured by time, but their intent deliberate. A warning, perhaps, a path, or a secret that had been meant to stay buried. She had spent years in the company of lies and half-truths, unraveling them thread by thread, but here, in the suffocating grip of the jungle, deception had an older, more permanent weight. "You see them too." The voice was soft, yet it did not startle her. She turned to find a man standing just beyond the tree line, a guide, lean and watchful, his gaze sharp with knowing. He stepped forward, one calloused hand reaching out to trace the symbols, his touch reverent. "Old signs," he murmured. "Very old." Evelyn studied him carefully. A settlement. He hesitated. A place of wealth, a place of betrayal. Her fingers tightened around the cigarette case in her pocket. "Betrayal, you say?" He glanced at her then, measuring her interest before continuing. "Long ago a treasure was hidden here. A man was chosen to guard it. But men," he gave the smallest of smiles, "men have weak hearts. And what happened to this guardian?" He tried to take what was not his. The man's expression did not change, and so he was made to stay. The words settled between them, heavy and final. The jungle had a way of keeping what it claimed: mistakes, secrets, lives. And yet, not everything that was lost remained hidden forever. Evelyn had learned that much already. She turned back to the tree, her mind sorting through the pieces of a puzzle that had not yet revealed its edges. The murdered man had not been an ordinary traveler. He had carried something someone had been willing to kill for. A cigarette case, etched with an inscription of an unpaid debt. A map concealed within his coat, its faded symbols matching the carvings now before her. A pattern was emerging, one that connected the past to the present with a thread of deception. And then, something else caught her eye. A single flower nestled among the roots of a fallen log, its violet petals tinged with a striking blaze of orange at the center. It stood out, incongruous among the jungle's deep greens and browns. She knelt, examining it closely. The waxy texture of its petals, the way its stem curved, this was not a native bloom. It did not belong here. Admiring the local flora, Miss Harcourt, she did not turn immediately. Only after plucking the flower delicately by the stem did she glance over her shoulder. Dr. Gabriel Stratton stood a few paces away, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. She twirled the flower between her fingers. "Local, do you think?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "A rare specimen, I believe." She studied him over the rim of her glasses, watching the flicker of something unreadable cross his face. A man of science would recognize an anomaly when he saw one, and Evelyn knew all too well that anomalies were never just accidents. The jungle was restless, murmuring secrets in the hush of shifting leaves and the soft breath of the wind through tangled vines. Evelyn Harcourt moved through the clearing, her fingers absently brushing against the strange bloom nestled in the folds of her shawl, a flower that did not belong, a detail too deliberate to be coincidence. The campfire flickered, casting wavering shadows over the weary survivors gathered around it, their exhaustion tinged with the weight of unspoken fears. Sir Reginald paced, muttering complaints about rescue delays, his impatience barely masking his unease. Vaza, watchful, honed the edge of his blade with practiced ease, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Evelyn Whittaker fussed over Andrew McAllister, the steward, still too pale, his wariness betraying something deeper than mere illness. And Dr. Stratton, he stood just at the edge of the fire's glow, his posture composed, his gaze lingering just a fraction too long on the map spread before them. Evelyn studied the fragmented parchment, its brittle edges curling, its faded ink forming the same winding symbols she had seen etched into the trees. But it was the delicate sketch near the bottom that captured her attention, a flower, drawn with meticulous detail, its resemblance to the bloom in her possession, uncanny. A symbol, a message, a warning. Someone had left this for them to find. Someone had ensured this mystery would not stay buried. The silence in the camp stretched as she traced a careful fingertip over the map's surface, arranging the scattered pieces before her with the precision of a puzzle master aligning the final clues. A cigarette case, its Art Deco engravings whispering of old debts unpaid. The map, leading them deeper into the jungle's secrets. The flower, an anomaly, a signal left in plain sight. And the body forgotten in the wreckage but not abandoned by its secrets. Strange, isn't it? The voice was smooth, measured, laced with something just shy of amusement. Dr. Stratton stood closer now, his gaze cool, assessing. Evelyn twirled the flower between her fingers. "Oh, Doctor, I find strange things quite ordinary." Her voice was light, but her eyes held a sharper edge. It is the ordinary things that are most peculiar. He hesitated, and that was telling. A man of science should have countered her with logic, with reason. Instead he only nodded, silent, thoughtful. She tucked the flower away, and turned her attention back to the map, the weight of the moment settling over the camp like the hush before a storm. A path had been laid out for them, winding through time and betrayal, its conclusion hidden in the dense unknown beyond the wreckage. Sir Reginald cleared his throat. "Well, Miss Harcourt, what have you found?" She smiled, slow and knowing. "Oh, nothing much, just an observation." Dr. Stratton leaned in slightly. "And what, pray, are you observing?" She tapped the map lightly. "That something has been left for us." Vaza's knife stilled against the sharpening stone, his lips curving into a slow, wolfish grin. "An invitation, then?" Evelyn's fingers brushed the flower one last time before she met his gaze. "Perhaps," she murmured, "and I suspect we're meant to accept it." The jungle, ever watchful, had spoken. And Evelyn was listening. The jungle hummed with an eerie stillness, its thick oppressive heat pressing down like an unseen force. The fire flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness, casting restless shadows over the scattered remnants of their ill-fated journey. Miss Eleanor Harcourt turned a gleaming cigarette case over in her fingers, the Art Deco engravings catching the firelight in delicate, dancing reflections. A torn, time-worn map lay spread before her, its inked pathways winding like veins through an ancient mystery, and beside it, an unusual flower, one that did not belong in this part of the world, yet had been placed there with unmistakable intent. "Strange, isn't it, Vaza?" she murmured, not lifting her gaze from the tableau of artifacts before her. Roland Vaza, perched on a jagged rock with the easy poise of a man accustomed to both danger and deception, gave a slow, wolfish smile. "If things didn't fit together so strangely, Miss Harcourt, the story wouldn't be half as interesting." His tone was one of casual amusement, but his dark eyes gleamed with something sharper, something watchful. Miss Harcourt traced a slender finger over the faded ink of the map. It was not merely a guide to a location, it was a trail, deliberately laid, meant to lead the right person, or the wrong one towards something hidden. But why? And by whom? And then there was the flower. It had not fallen there by accident. Someone had placed it deliberately, a marker, a message, or perhaps a warning. "Someone wanted us to see this," she said softly, more to herself than to the others. Or Sir Reginald interjected dryly, pacing in restless agitation. "Someone wanted us to think we were meant to see it." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Honestly, Miss Harcourt, You do have a way of turning everything into a grand intrigue. And you, Sir Reginald, she replied with a polite smile, have a way of dismissing things until they come knocking at your door. There was a sharpness beneath her pleasantries, the gleam of a mind that had seen too much to believe in coincidences. Dr. Stratton, who had thus far remained silent, leaned forward with evident interest. If it is a message, then it was left by someone who expected someone else to find it. He gestured toward the cigarette case. And that means there was an intent behind it. But what kind? Miss Harcourt clicked the case open with an elegant flick of her fingers. Inside, engraved in careful, deliberate strokes, was a single phrase: debts unpaid are settled in time. A hush settled over the group, the weight of those words heavy with unspoken meaning. This was not a simple accident. This was not a random collection of lost objects. This was history clawing its way back to the present, demanding to be heard. Somewhere someone had left this message, someone who had unfinished business. Vaser studied the engraving, then flicked his gaze back to Miss Harcourt, something almost amused in his expression. This isn't just a mystery, he mused. This is a game. Miss Harcourt snapped the cigarette case shut with a decisive click. And we appear to be its players. She turned back to the map, her fingers hovering over the faded lines that stretched toward the unknown. There was no question about what needed to be done. This path had been laid for someone to follow, and tomorrow they would. The jungle, restless and alive, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. It was waiting, watching, knowing that the game had only just begun. The jungle pulsed with unseen life, a living, breathing entity that concealed its secrets beneath thick canopies and ancient roots. The fire crackled weakly in the humid air, casting elongated shadows that danced against the wreckage of their ill-fated journey. Seated at a makeshift table, fashioned from broken crates and salvaged wood, Miss Evelyn Drake traced a gloved finger over the intricate engravings on a silver cigarette case, the cool metal, an odd contrast against the oppressive heat. Before her lay a torn, yellowed map, its edges curled with age, and beside it, a rare orchid, deep violet, its petals, unfurling like a secret, whispered in the dark. None of these objects should have belonged together, yet here they were, gathered in deliberate defiance of logic. She exhaled slowly. Someone had left them, someone who had known exactly what they were doing. Roland Sykes, ever the picture of calculated ease, leaned against a fallen tree, his gaze sharp, despite the air of indifference he wore like an old coat. You look as though you've solved something, Miss Drake, he mused, eyes flicking toward the cigarette case in her hand. She didn't answer immediately, instead aligning the case against the worn ink of the map, tilting it slightly, just enough for the swirling designs to fall into place. A revelation settled over her like a slow tide. These were not mere trinkets. The carvings on the jungle trees, the embellishments on the case, and the faint curling script on the map, they were identical. Someone had left a message, and their victim, it seemed, had been one of the few who understood it. A pattern, she murmured, more to herself than the others. Sir Leopold Whitmore scoffed, shifting irritably. Patterns, maps, engraved cigarette cases. Honestly, Miss Drake, not everything is an enigma waiting to be solved. He rubbed his temples, his patience thinning under the weight of circumstance. Dr. Henry Caldwell, seated stiffly on a log, adjusted his spectacles, his gaze darting between her and the objects before her. And yet, Sir Leopold, it seems rather odd that our unfortunate friend should be found with these particular items in his possession, he said, his voice laced with reluctant curiosity. Odd, Vaser echoed with a faint smirk, or deliberate. Miss Drake allowed herself a small smile. The cigarette case, the map, the flower, they weren't simply keepsakes, they were coordinates, a cipher, a silent call to those who knew how to listen. And someone among them had known. Someone had wanted these pieces desperately enough to kill for them. Her gaze swept across the firelit faces of her companions, Sir Leopold too quick to dismiss, his aristocratic features tight with unease, Dr. Caldwell, his detachment cracking at the edges, Roland Sykes, relaxed yet entirely too observant, Eleanor Walsh, the ever-composed governess, whose hands were just a touch too still. And then there was Peter Hargrove, the steward, shifting in his seat as though the jungle itself was pressing in on him. Miss Drake straightened, her fingers closing around the cigarette case. "You see," she said, her voice measured and calm, when our unfortunate companion met his end, "it was not by chance. It was because he carried something far more valuable than his own life." A hush fell over them, the jungle seeming to tighten its grip, listening, waiting. Vaser tilted his head, amused. "And what, pray, did he carry?" Miss Drake smiled, slipping the cigarette case into her pocket with deliberate finality. The past, and the past, she knew, had a way of demanding to be heard. The jungle held its breath, as though it, too, was waiting for the truth to finally emerge. Miss Evelyn Drake sat forward, her fingers laced lightly over her knee, her voice calm but edged with something undeniable, certainty. "Misfortune and malice," she murmured, letting the words hang in the thick air. "And this, I assure you, is the latter." She traced a fingertip over the silver cigarette case resting beside her, its delicate engravings catching the firelight. "A fine piece," she continued, with an inscription that is peculiar, "a debt never repaid, a sentiment of obligation. No, I think not. This is not nostalgia, this is unfinished business." Her gaze flicked briefly towards Sir William Ashford, whose throat bobbed in a telltale swallow. She allowed a small pause before moving on. "Then of course there are the carvings etched deep into the jungle trees, geometric, deliberate. I recognized the pattern, though not at first, but when I examined this case more closely, I saw it. The engravings here are identical." Roland Graves, the ever-watchful opportunist, smirked from his perch against the wreckage. "A secret language, then?" "Precisely," Miss Drake said, inclining her head slightly. "A cipher, a message left behind for those who knew how to read it. And then there is this." She reached for the worn scrap of parchment, a fragment of a much larger map, its faded ink stubbornly resisting time. This was meant to lead somewhere. And most curious of all, the orchid, the one found at the site of the wreck. An exquisite specimen, foreign to this part of the jungle, which brings me to our murderer's first mistake. A hush settled over the group. The fire crackled, its embers glowing like the eyes of unseen creatures lurking beyond the clearing. "You see," Miss Drake continued, her voice as steady as the pulse of the jungle, "murder is rarely a thing of impulse. No matter how it may seem, it requires planning, precision, and our murderer planned this very well, indeed." Her gaze swept the assembled survivors, each of them now a portrait of wary silence. Sir William, stiff-backed with the arrogance of old money. Dr. Lawrence Finch, arms crossed in the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent his life dissecting both bodies and truths. Roland Graves, too self-assured, too knowing. Eleanor Hartley, her composure just a shade too careful. And then there was Peter Wren, the steward, his eyes darting toward the jungle, as though searching for an escape that did not exist. "Our victim," she continued, "was not simply an unfortunate traveler. He was involved in something delicate, something of great historical and financial significance. The carvings, the map, the flower, each tells a story, and that story is one of smuggling." Dr. Finch tensed. "Smuggling?" "Quite so," Miss Drake said, her voice edged with something close to satisfaction, "of artifacts. Priceless relics, lost to time, and where such treasures exist, so too does greed, and where there is greed, there is always danger." She turned to Sir William, her eyes sharp, assessing. "You have spoken at length about your business dealings, Sir William, yet you never quite specified what those dealings entailed. Investments, you said. But investing in what precisely?" Sir William's face darkened. "You dare." "I suggest nothing," Miss Drake interrupted smoothly. "I simply observe, and what I have observed is that you were far more concerned with retrieving your lost valise than securing a proper rescue. as if it contained something of great value. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. Miss Drake allowed the silence to stretch, then shifted her attention with delicate precision. "But you, Dr. Finch, you are not entirely without secrets, are you?" The doctor's expression hardened. "I beg your pardon." Miss Drake tilted her head, watching him. "Academic circles can be quite competitive, can they not? And your career, well, it has not been without its setbacks. One might imagine you had quite the motive to ensure your rival never reached his destination." A flicker of anger flashed across his face before vanishing beneath the mask of practiced control. "And then," Miss Drake continued, her tone almost teasing now, "we have Mr. Graves, a man of many trades, as he so eloquently put it. I wonder, have you ever procured items of the historical variety, Mr. Graves?" He chuckled, slow and amused. "Miss Drake, surely you don't think me capable of something so unsavory?" "Capable? Most certainly," she said pleasantly. "But responsible? No, I suspect you deal in acquisitions, not in blood." Graves grinned, but said nothing. And then, at last, she turned to Eleanor Hartley. The woman had gone pale. "And you, my dear," Miss Drake said, her voice softening, but not losing its weight. "You knew the victim, didn't you?" Eleanor's lips parted, then pressed together. A pause, then barely above a whisper, "I treated him once." Miss Drake's gaze never wavered. "Yes," she said, "but it was more than that, wasn't it?" The jungle pressed in, thick with waiting. The truth was no longer a distant thing, a hidden relic buried beneath time and leaves. It was here, rising, inevitable. And Miss Drake, ever patient, ever watching, knew that soon, very soon, it would reveal itself entirely. The night was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against the air like the dense jungle mist. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows over the gathered figures, each one frozen in the grip of uncertainty. At the center of it all sat Miss Eleanor Graves, her presence deceptively unassuming, hands folded neatly in her lap, sharp eyes scanning the faces before her. She had unraveled more mysteries than most would dare to imagine, and tonight another truth lay on the brink of revelation. "A murder," she began, her voice measured, "is never truly an act of impulse, no matter how desperately the guilty might claim otherwise. It is at its heart a culmination of choices, of intentions whispered in the dark, long before a blade is drawn or a poison is poured." Her gaze lingered on Captain Alistair Rowe, the once distinguished officer, whose polished composure now bore the faintest fractures. "You spoke often of honor, Captain, of duty and debts repaid in blood. But tell me, was it honor that led you to retrieve that silver locket from the deceased's grasp before the authorities arrived? A curious thing, that locket, engraved with initials that, I dare say, do not belong to you." The captain's jaw clenched, but before he could interject, she turned her attention elsewhere. "And you, Miss Holloway," she continued smoothly, her gaze falling upon the governess whose trembling fingers betrayed her feigned composure. "A woman of quiet diligence, always observing, always listening, yet one who conveniently neglected to mention that you had a history with our victim, a history sealed away in letters, letters that no longer reside in your possession, I presume." Miss Holloway's breath hitched, but Miss Graves was already moving on, her words sharp as a scalpel peeling away the pretense layer by layer. "Then there is Dr. Winfield," she mused, tilting her head ever so slightly, "a man of science, of cold logic, and yet you failed to explain why a vial of atropine was missing from your kit the very morning our unfortunate friend met his demise." The doctor's face drained of color, but before he could summon a defense, she had already shifted her focus. "Lastly, our ever-charming Mr. Dane," she murmured, her tone light but laced with quiet steel. "A man of business, of transactions made behind closed doors. But one must wonder, what was it about our victim that unsettled you so? What was it he knew that you so desperately wished to bury?" The silence stretched, thick as the jungle air. No one moved, no one dared breathe. Then a whisper of a laugh, low, bitter. All eyes turned to Miss Holloway as she exhaled, shaking her head. "You don't understand," she murmured, voice trembling. "He wasn't a victim, he was a monster." Miss Graves said nothing, merely watching as the truth unspooled at last. "He knew things," Miss Holloway continued, her fingers curling into fists. "He kept them like weapons, waited until the perfect moment to strike. And when he did, it was always too late to stop him." The firelight flickered, its glow catching the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. "You say murder is a choice," she whispered, "but sometimes it is the only choice left." A gust of wind stirred the trees, the jungle whispering secrets of its own. Miss Graves merely sighed, the weight of the revelation settling upon the group like a shroud. "Ah," she murmured, "but that is what they all say, in the end." The jungle had never been silent, not truly. Even in the dead of night, it breathed leaves whispering, unseen creatures stirring, the distant hoot of an owl cutting through the thick humidity. But tonight, beneath the shroud of darkness, it was as if the very air itself held its breath, waiting. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing like dying stars, casting flickering light on the weary faces of those who remained. They were no longer just survivors of a crash. No, they were witnesses now, witnesses to a crime, to a truth too heavy to ignore. At the center of it all sat Miss Eleanor Hartley, composed as ever, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her sharp eyes scanning the group with quiet, knowing patience. "Confessions," she mused, her voice smooth as the smoke curling into the night, "are peculiar things. They do not free us, as one might hope, they only serve to illuminate the cage we have already built for ourselves." Her gaze settled on Clara Davenport, the once respected nurse, whose composure had long since crumbled. The weight of her own words hung in the air, each syllable spoken moments ago, now irreversible. "I didn't mean to," Clara whispered, her voice raw, shaking. "I only wanted to stop him, to make him understand that he had no right to ruin me." Her fingers curled into fists, knuckles white with tension, but he always la. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. No one looked away, no one dared. Theodore Blackwood, the expedition leader, let out a slow breath. "You struck him," he said flatly. "With what?" Clara swallowed hard, as if the memory itself burned in her throat. "A lantern, it was just there, I didn't even think. One moment he was standing, taunting me, and the next," she trailed off, her breath hitching. "He was so quiet afterward." Miss Hartley regarded her for a long moment, then with the utmost gentleness, she spoke. "I imagine it was a sharp intake of breath." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body trembling. "I didn't mean to kill him." A soft sigh escaped Miss Hartley's lips, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost tender. "Yes, my dear, I do believe you." No one moved, and then finally, William Hawthorne, the group's financier, cleared his throat, his voice clipped and pragmatic. "Well," he muttered, straightening his cuffs, "that was unpleasant." His words felt almost absurd in the face of what had just been laid bare. Beside him, James Holloway, ever the cynic, let out a quiet scoff. "The man is dead, Hawthorne." "Yes, yes." Hawthorne waved a dismissive hand. "Tragic business, but I rather think we have more pressing concerns, such as survival." Miss Hartley rose gracefully to her feet, brushing a speck of dust from her skirt. "Ah, but you see, Mr. Hawthorne, survival and justice are not mutually exclusive." She turned back to Clara, her gaze unwavering. "I suspect you will find that both are now out of your hands." Clara did not resist when Holloway stepped forward, his expression grim but not unkind. She simply nodded, her face hollow with exhaustion. The jungle listened, and just like that, the mystery was at an end. Or so it seemed. But as the night stretched on, the fire dwindling to mere embers, an unease settled over the remaining survivors. The weight of suspicion had lifted, but in its place lay something far more unsettling, the knowledge that the truth, no matter how buried, always left behind roots. Miss Hartley took quiet stock of the group. Hawthorne, already restoring his sense of self-importance, adjusting his posture as if this whole ordeal had merely delayed his inevitable return to civilization. Holloway, arms crossed, his calculating mind already turning over new puzzles, Blackwood, restless, his fingers tracing the map he had studied so often, as if searching for a way out of more than just the jungle. And Clara, who sat apart, her shoulders hunched inward, hands clasped in her lap, emptied by the confession that had stolen the last remnants of her control. "Well," Holloway finally said, his voice dry, "assuming we don't all turn on each other next, we should start thinking about an actual plan." Miss Hartley offered him a pleasant smile. "Oh, I already have one, Mr. Holloway," and by morning, they were moving again. Order had been restored, in its own fragile way. Using fragments of the wreckage, a signal was fashioned in the clearing, its reflective shards flashing like a beacon beneath the morning sun. Meanwhile, Blackwood and Holloway worked on constructing a permanent fire signal, ensuring that smoke would be visible even beyond the dense canopy. But as the group worked, as the morning pressed forward, Miss Hartley's mind remained elsewhere. The cigarette case, the map fragment, the letter. Small things, insignificant to most, but they told a story, and the story wasn't over, because even as Clara Davenport sat in exhausted silence, accepting her fate, Miss Hartley knew one thing with absolute certainty: this had never been just about a single death. The roots of the past ran deep, tangled, waiting, and secrets, no matter how well hidden, always found their way to the surface. As the dense shadows of the jungle began to fade, the first streaks of dawn bled through the tangled branches, painting the sky in muted hues of gold and pink. The heavy dampness of the night still clung to the air, but the atmosphere within the makeshift camp had shifted. No more confessions, no further revelations, only an unsettling silence. Evelyn Whittaker sat apart, her face composed yet strained, as if the weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted, though her shoulders still bore its lingering burden. Then came the sound, a distant rhythmic murmur, mechanical and persistent, rising beneath the jungle's natural symphony. At first they dismissed it as another trick of the wilderness, the kind that had tormented their imaginations through the endless hours since the crash. But then, unmistakably, the crackling of a radio transmission cut through the dense air. Sir Reginald was the first to his feet. Good heavens, at last, Dr. Stratton exhaled sharply, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. "I can hardly believe it." Roland Varsir, ever the skeptic, merely smirked. "Rescued, perhaps. But survival is an entirely different matter." The rescue team arrived in swift, disciplined movements. Sharp commands were issued, the wreckage was surveyed, and the dead were accounted for. Evelyn was taken aside, her expression unreadable. She did not resist. Perhaps she had already surrendered, not to the authorities, but to the crushing weight of her own conscience. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet satisfaction, a small nod confirming what she had long suspected. Truth, after all, had a way of emerging when one least expected it. As the survivors were led toward the waiting transport, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. The jungle, bathed in the soft glow of morning, was no less menacing in the daylight. It had witnessed deception, desperation, and death, yet standing at its heart, she could not shake the feeling that it had merely watched, silent, indifferent to the schemes of men, and the fragile morality of human nature. Truth, she mused, was a peculiar thing. It was not always noble, nor was it always just. It was merely inevitable. The case was closed, the mystery unraveled, and yet, Miss Marple knew that there would always be more puzzles waiting to be solved, more secrets lurking in the quiet spaces of the world. As she stepped forward, following the others to safety, she allowed herself a small knowing smile, for now at least, the jungle could keep its whispers. The oppressive weight of the wilderness lifted, replaced by the reassuring presence of civilization, walls, doors, telephones, the small ordinary things that had once seemed trivial, now carried a quiet comfort. Miss Marple sat primly in a modest police station in Casablanca, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The high ceilings and the slow whir of a ceiling fan lent the room a stark colonial sterility, functional, but devoid of charm. Papers shuffled, typewriters clacked, and the faint scent of ink and tobacco lingered in the air. Across from her sat Captain Arigiro, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He had listened patiently to her account, nodding at the appropriate moments, making precise notes in his ledger. Now he studied her with an assessing gaze. "A fascinating story, Mademoiselle Marple," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "A murder, an artifact smuggling ring, and a trail of cryptic symbols leading deep into the jungle." Miss Marple smiled, unfazed. "Life does have a way of being rather dramatic, Captain." Arigiro exhaled through his nose. "And yet there is something unfinished about it." Miss Marple set her tea down gently. "I rather think the murderer has been accounted for." Arigiro inclined his head slightly. "Yes, but the motive, the true motive." He leaned forward, his voice measured. "Murder is rarely as simple as it appears." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, indeed, that is precisely what makes it so very interesting." Arigiro gestured to the file before him. "This man, our unfortunate—" As Miss Marple stepped out into the cool Casablanca air, a gentle breeze brushed against her cheek. The case was over, or perhaps it was simply waiting for its next turn. The telegram slid across the desk with an unsettling finality, its creased paper bearing the weight of something far more intricate than a mere smuggling operation. Captain Arigiro's eyes, sharp and calculating, watched Miss Marple as she studied the name embedded in the typed lines, Roland Versier. "How very curious." "Mademoiselle," Arigiro's voice was smooth but edged with something unreadable. "Do you truly believe this was only a crime of passion? A desperate woman silencing a man who knew too much?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her expression as placid as still water. "Oh, Captain," she mused, "passion and profit so often go hand in hand." Arigiro gave a thin smile, though it never quite reached his eyes. "Precisely," he murmured, leaning back. "The real question then is not just who killed him, but who he was working for. And in the end, whether he was the hunter or the hunted." Miss Marple lifted her teacup, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said, "I rather think that is the question, isn't it? The case, as far as the authorities were concerned, was closed. And yet, Miss Marple knew, mysteries had a way of lingering long after the final chapter had been written. The English countryside, in all its gentle serenity, stood in stark contrast to the suffocating, humid embrace of the jungle. At St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's sanctuary, the garden was alive with the scent of lavender and honeysuckle, the neatly trimmed hedges a picture of perfect order, so unlike the tangled, lawless wilderness she had left behind. At a wrought-iron table beneath the shade of a grand oak, she sat with her leather-bound journal, the delicate porcelain teacup beside her gathering tiny ripples in the breeze. The weeks had passed, and yet the case remained with her, not as a haunting, but as an unfinished verse in a melody long played. The cigarette case, its engraved message of unpaid debt, had not merely been a trinket, it had been a warning, a silent testament to betrayals that stretched further back than any single crime. The jungle carvings too had not been mere decoration, but a language unto themselves, a dialect spoken by those who lived in the shadows of history. But then, was this not true of all human interactions? People, like artifacts, bore their own inscriptions, some written plainly, others buried beneath layers of civility and pretense. A sparrow flitted onto the edge of the table, tilting its head in quick, darting movements, as if deciphering her thoughts. Miss Marple smiled. Life, she reflected, was much like the jungle, filled with whispers, with symbols left for those who knew where to look. Some mysteries were grand, centuries-old secrets, lost treasures, intricate webs of deception stretching across continents. Others were modest, the neighbor who watched too closely, the letter hidden in a desk for decades, the missing brooch no one spoke of. And yet, all mysteries, no matter their scale, could be traced back to the same thing: human nature. She dipped her pen into ink, the late afternoon sun casting golden light over the garden as she began to write, her tidy script neat and deliberate. A pause, the tip of her pen tapped gently against the page before she added her final line. There will always be more puzzles to solve. She closed the journal with a knowing smile. The jungle case was behind her, its guilty parties unmasked, its truths laid bare. And yet, she could not shake the certainty that somewhere, in a quiet drawing room, or the hushed corners of a seaside town, another mystery was already taking shape. For the world was full of secrets, of hidden layers waiting to be unraveled. And as long as there were people, there would be puzzles. With that thought, she lifted her teacup, took a sip, and let the breeze carry away the last lingering whispers of the jungle,